Close your eyes, go back 1 year. Most of you would have assumed that US tariffs rising from 1.5% to 13% would trigger a major adverse shock to the euro area economy. The exchange rate does not behave as expected. Rather than depreciating, the euro has appreciated substantially. We don't want to be left in the dust. I don't. Thank you so much, Oli, in the country of ice hockey, where you excel at very continental European sports, UK included, actually. So it's very nice to be back in Finland and to be back in Helsinki. And here in Finland, the idea that economics cannot be separated from geopolitics is hardly new. During the 1990s, as the Soviet Union collapsed, Finland lost more than 10% of its GDP when trade with its eastern neighbor suddenly evaporated. And few countries know better the cost of ignoring geopolitical realities. Today, the rest of Europe is facing a similar reckoning. We find ourselves in a new world, one where policymakers can no longer confine themselves to traditional economics and financial variables, however talented the economists who practice those are. Now we must factor geoeconomics into our analysis. The term geoeconomics was coined in 1990s by Edward Luttwak, who described geoeconomics as, I quote, the admixture of the logic of conflict with the methods of commerce. So it is not protectionism in the old sense of sheltering vulnerable industries. Instead, it is trade deployed as a tool of power, a strategy of influence and dominance. This approach has been around for some time, most visibly during the US-China trade disputes that unfolded during the first Trump administration. The unjustifiable war in Ukraine and the sanctions that followed have also reshaped the European landscape. But 2025 marks the first year in which Europe itself is on the receiving end. We currently face the highest tariffs since the day of Smooth-Ole in the 1930s, imposed by our largest trading partner. Global trade is being reshaped as other countries respond to tariffs directed at them. And in the span of just a few months, we have seen a surge in trade uncertainty and sharp swings in exchange rates. So, now is a good time, and here is a good place to take stock of what we have learned so far and what that implies for monetary policy. So let me comment on expectations versus reality in relation to the trade wars. Close your eyes, go back 1 year. Most of you would have assumed that US tariffs rising from 1.5% to 13% would trigger a major adverse shock to the euro area economy. And indeed, most trade models judged the imposition of tariffs to be on net negative for euro area growth and likely positive for inflation, at least in the short run. This was broadly our internal assessment in December of last year. Although we pondered that with a high level of uncertainty. 3 channels were usually seen as decisive in producing such an outcome: retaliation, exchange rate, uncertainty. First, retaliation. Well, reciprocal tariffs were expected to raise import costs and reverberate through supply chains. And in most models, this retaliation channel was by far the largest driver of higher short-term inflation. Second, the exchange rate. Tariffs were expected to trigger a depreciation of the euro against the dollar, driven by expectations of higher US rates and a smaller US trade deficit, thereby amplifying imported inflation. Third uncertainty, elevated trade policy uncertainty, was expected to weigh heavily on business investment and growth, often more than the direct effect of tariffs on exports themselves. And this was expected to be the largest negative force on growth. Well, as you can imagine, some of these assumptions have not been borne out. And this is because the tariffs were not isolated in and of themselves. They were a symptom of a broader geopolitical shift, one that triggered political economy dynamics beyond the reach of our standard models. Let's go back and start with retaliation. In Europe and globally in the main, it has so far been very limited. In response to the US tariffs on steel and aluminium, the European Union announced counter tariffs on around 26 billion worth of American goods. But the European Union suspended them once a deal was struck in July. They were never enforced. Pressure from major industrial groups to avoid a prolonged cycle of tit-for-tat measures, as well as concerns about jeopardizing US support for the war in Ukraine, ultimately outweigh pure economic calculus. As a result, we have not yet seen significant supply chain disruption. Global supply chain pressures remain contained, and in the euro area, bottleneck indicators are close to historical average. And if anything, rather than blocked supply chain, the euro area is facing rising imports. The EU trade deficit with China has risen by around 10% this year, although this was driven mainly by weaker Chinese demand than by diverted trade flows that, of course, are under close scrutiny. That's for retaliation. The exchange rate. It has not behaved as expected. Rather than depreciating, the euro has appreciated substantially. And since the start of this year, it has risen by anywhere between 12 and 13%, depending on the day when you actually measure, against the US dollar, while the nominal effective exchange rate has increased by 6% and the real effective exchange rate by 5%. And this reflects the fact that the imposition of US tariffs coincided with a broader re-evaluation of the country's position in the global financial system. Investors began to question whether the US dollar would continue to warrant its status as the ultimate safe haven currency. Another political economy factor that narrow, tariff-focused models excluded by assumption. The international role of the euro has helped insulate us from the resulting exchange rate volatility, with 52% of our imports invoiced in our own currency, but of course, many key imports, particularly of commodities, are still priced in dollars. The euro's appreciation has therefore contained imported inflation from supply chains, while at the same time placing an additional drag on growth. So the third one is the effect of uncertainty. The effects have been more in line with our expectations. The expected cumulative impact of tariffs and uncertainty on growth is around 0.7 percentage points between 25 and 27, compared with our projections last December. Still, these effects have not been as strong as we had anticipated. For example, only about a quarter of the downward revision for next year, compared with December last year, is due to uncertainty. And this is partly because trade policy uncertainty fell faster than we expected as soon as the deal with the United States was concluded. It is also because the euro area has taken internal measures to boost growth that have helped counter external weakness. And in particular, governments in Europe have committed to the largest increase in rearmament in decades, with some reversing years of massive underinvestment. Government investment is now expected to add 0.25 percentage points to growth between 25 and 27, offsetting around 1/3 of the trade shock. The European Union has also pushed ahead with new trade agreements, which will support growth. The Mercosur and Mexico deals, now being adopted, cover more than 3% of extra euro area goods exports, while agreements currently under negotiations account for a further 6%. And I'm here referring to India, Indonesia, and the Philippines. So this is another example of a response that models could not capture beforehand. Trade pressures have led European governments to reevaluate their broader trade and security relationships around the world. And that has prompted an endogenous investment response. So all in all, with no retaliation, an appreciation of the exchange rate of the euro, tariffs have had little inflationary impact so far, with their adverse effects mainly limited to growth. And those effects, however, have been relatively modest thanks to the domestic response. So in an environment of high uncertainty, understanding the nature of shocks is a precondition for getting the baseline protection right. We heard lots of wonderful comments about this particular analysis of what is exactly the nature of the shock. But capturing the balance of risk is just as crucial, so that we are prepared for a situation in which the baseline may prove obsolete and can, as a result, act preemptively if necessary. And this was, as Olli Rehn described for you this morning during his remarks, one of the key conclusions of our recent strategy review, to emphasize more risks and uncertainty in our decision and not just rely on our central projections. Not to say that we will publish scenarios all the time, no, but we will certainly use them to try to balance those risks and measure them as accurately as we can. So initially, we viewed the risks to growth from US tariffs as tilted to the downside. This assessment was informed by extensive scenario analysis, including escalation scenarios and possible offsetting forces, notably the growth impact of a sustained increase in defense and infrastructure spending. And overall, these scenarios have consistently shown that the most salient risks, those that could push growth furthest from its current path, lie on the downside rather than the upside. For example, ECB staff found that severe escalation in trade tensions could lower growth cumulatively by about 1 percentage point over the projection horizon. The potential boost from higher defense spending would offset, but would not be sufficient to offset this, even if all countries were to deliver fully on their NATO commitments. Now, this tilt in the risk balance remains roughly in place today. But at our last monetary policy meeting, we judged risks to growth to be more balanced. And we did so because the likelihood of major tariff-related downside risks materializing has fallen owing to the new trade deal that was concluded and materialized in August. Now, meanwhile, we initially judged inflation risks to be two-sided, with plausible scenarios that could push inflation off track in either direction. But as new information has come in, the range of risks on both sides has also narrowed. In particular, the absence of significant EU retaliation has reduced the risk that higher import tariffs might drive inflation above the baseline. Our scenario analysis also points to inflation risks that remain well contained. If trade tensions were to reignite, staff project only moderately lower inflation in 2027, which is currently the last year of our projection horizon. Higher spending on defense equipment, by contrast, would only modestly raise inflation, given its relatively small weight in the consumption basket. Staff have also examined scenarios that would affect prices more directly. So on the downside, Chinese export prices being lowered further as a strategic response to tariff. And on the upside, more pronounced bottlenecks in global supply chains. In both cases, however, the impact would be limited under reasonable assumptions, with inflation in 2027 differing by only 0.1 to 0.2 percentage point. So what does that imply for our monetary policy? I have said, and many of my colleagues on the Governing Council have also said and repeated, that we are in a good place. And this was largely a reference to the fading of the large inflation shock we faced in recent years, which is now essentially over in the euro area. But there are also, I said largely a reference, but not only. There are also three additional reasons why it applies for the current situation. First, because trade shocks are not creating new inflationary pressure. We are not confronted with the classic policy trade-off where the central bank faces stalling growth and rising inflation. This has already allowed us to cut policy rate by 100 basis points since December, cushioning the impact while keeping medium-term inflation on track. Second, insofar as we can model the future, the risks to inflation appear quite contained in both directions. And third, with policy rate now at 2%, we are well placed to respond if the risks to inflation were to shift or if new shocks emerge that threaten our target. At the same time, we all know that we are navigating a far more difficult environment than before, beset by war, tariffs, and uncertainty, which we must also factor into our policy. If we consider the known knowns, the risks appear well bounded. But if we consider the known unknowns, above all, how euro area companies will adapt in this new setting, firms are still running down inventories and absorbing the shock, part of the shock, in their margins, so the full effect of US tariffs have yet to become clear. And finally, there are the unknown unknowns. In a world of geoeconomic trouble, new trade and geopolitical shocks will remain a constant feature of our environment, as Eric was saying in the previous panel. How these forces play out will have unavoidable effects on monetary policy, not only through their impact on growth, but also on potential growth. If firms interpret the new environment as a lasting confidence shock, we could see investment shift out of the euro area. Where to is a question. Preliminary staff analysis suggests that all else equal, tariffs are likely to weigh negatively on potential growth. Lower potential growth would in turn put downward pressure on real rates and reduce the policy space available. But this is not the only path. Other paths are possible if governments act decisively and give firms new reasons to be confident. There's a lot of pressure currently on some of our authorities when it comes to delivering of some of the prescriptions identified by Draghi, later, and a few others. And while things are not moving as fast as we would all like, things are moving. One factor often overlooked in the tariff debate is that our internal market is far more important for trade than the global market. Staff analysis at the ECB shows that an increase of just 2% of intra-euro area trade would be enough to offset the loss of exports to the United States caused by higher tariffs. This is a compelling reason to implement the reforms that I just mentioned earlier, particularly simplifying burdensome regulation, completing the single market, and building a genuine European capital market. The same reforms would also help European companies adopt, I'm sorry, Olli, artificial intelligence more rapidly. This would result in a positive shock for potential growth, helping to balance the negative forces coming from abroad. In short, nothing about our future is fate, and there is no room for complacency by any party. But for our part, as European Central Bank, we cannot pre-commit to any future rate path, whether one of action or inaction. And we will, and we must remain agile and ready to respond to the data as they come in. So I can assure you that this is currently a pretty unusual time to be a policymaker in monetary matters. We do have wonderful economists, and they do try their best, but even the best of the best occasionally acknowledge that they have to be humble and that we simply don't know. But we can take comfort in having overcome a large inflation shock after the pandemic and in how the economy has coped so far with an upheaval in trade relations. As Agnes was saying, it was a bit of a crash test, and so far, passing. But we must remain alert to the possibility that not all the consequences are visible today, and that the new shocks may still lie ahead. So as we look into the future, we do so mindful of Finland's long tradition of sisu, courage and inner strength in the face of uncertainty. Sisu is not a show of fleeting bravery, but rather a fierce determination and perseverance to continue fighting, even when the going gets tough. We're in a good place today, but that place is not fixed forever. Our task is to sustain it with agility, humility, and a firm grounding in the data. I thank you very much. What do you want me to do? Sit or?
Maybe you can stay there.
Okay.
So thank you very much, Madame Lagarde. I understood that you would be ready to take a few questions from the audience.
I said two or three.
2 or 3?
Okay.
So who wants to be the number one? Okay.
Thank you, President Lagarde, for a clear and excellent exposition of geoeconomics and European policy. Because you didn't mention enough things, so the US, there was a reference to a trade war, so forth, the Draghi report, the Leto report, many things. But one thing that you did not mention, and I was wondering about, is how do you see the European economy, European policy in response to the rise of China? There was an article by David Atour in the New York Times about the China Shock 2.0, where the rise of China's morphing into high-value exports such as electric vehicles, batteries, so forth, areas that Europe used to be or is quite dominant in. Do you see that this is a challenge or an opportunity for Europe, and how does that factor into the geoeconomic set of risks that you talked about? Thank you.
I have to divorce myself from the trade minister that I was once and only look at it with my current function as president of the ECB. And of course, we are monitoring the volume of import, volume of exports, the risk of rerouting, the risk of redirecting. And this is, the development of those factors would obviously have an impact on our prices, on our competitive position, and all of that matters a lot. Now, there was a lot of assumption that the trade that would otherwise have been directed from China to the United States would be redirected, not rerouted, redirected to Europe. We haven't seen much of that, but of course, it is something that we have to monitor. I think the authorities outside our monetary remit, the Commission, the trade authorities in China have a dialogue that is ongoing, which is particularly focused on this risk of redirecting. There is rerouting in play. That is definitely something that you can actually measure. You can analyze the flow of goods coming from one supplier to the ultimate receiving countries, and the number of steps along the way is different from what it was a year ago. So we're looking at all that to measure and determine the role that it would have in terms of prices and the impact it would have on inflation. But so far, it is not what we had sort of instantly feared. But everything in monetary policy and such developments have a lag time about it, and rerouting or reorganizing supply chains take quite a while. So watching, not conclusive in any direction at the moment.
Thank you. More questions? There, and please state your name and the organization. Thank you.
Elisa Newby from Bank of Finland. In Brussels...
Thank you for your hospitality.
Thank you so much, Madame Lagarde, for this excellent speech that gave lots of food for thought. It was recently reported in Brussels that only about 10–11% of the Mario Draghi's recommended reforms have been kind of completed or even taken on the board. So my question is that what could the Eurosystem, ECB, do to encourage and speed up the process of reform so that the competitiveness of the European Union would be improved? Thank you.
Thank you for a really relevant, pertinent question, and one that makes me suffer, I have to tell you. I think we Europeans, and I'm speaking under the control of a former commissioner, Olli Rehn, we have to come to terms with the fact that change is taking place at a much faster pace than what it used to be 20 years ago. And I think that the speed at which we examine legislation or propose legislation, the speed at which political leaders organize themselves, needs to be significantly accelerated. I'll share one frustration. I don't want to comment too much because, number one, we have not conducted this exercise to conclude that only 11% has been already implemented. We know that there is a lot in the making and in the works, and I can see for myself that there is momentum. I have attended enough European councils to know that around the table and with the Commission there is definitely a momentum. But we are victim of our own legacies and complications and this democratic process that we praise ourselves with, and rightly so, but which is operating as too much of a drag at a time when speed is really of the essence. I'll share one frustration with you. When I started back 6 years ago, I was adamant to push for the digital euro and to make sure that we would be digitally anchored with central bank money. Given the time that it takes, and this is currently pending before the European Parliament, given the time that it takes, I will be gone. In other words, my mandate will have expired when the digital euro is eventually launched for good. This is too long. It takes time. When you want to launch something, it has to be right. And the same applies for securitization, for capital market union, for banking union, and what have you. but we just have to accelerate. So my plea is for an understanding of the speed at which reforms have to take place and change has to occur. Because we don't want to be left in the dust. I don't.